Hi guys, and welcome to episode 21 of the From the Vault podcast. I, as always, am your host, Nathaniel Forsyth, and with me is my co-host, Holthauser. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. How are you, Nathaniel?
I'm alright. Had a productive day. Seen some people I didn't see in a while. It's been alright.
That's good. It's good to catch up with friends.
Yeah, I enjoy it.
Right. So, for today, I know spoiler season's your favorite season,
God, I love it.
but we've been doing a lot of spoiler stuff. I mean, the last two episodes have been like looking back on Ravnica, getting hyped about Ravnica, then talking a bit about Ravnica, what Ravnica standard is going to be like. So, I thought this week we'd do something a little bit different, but in a similar vein. We can still share your love for new spoiler cards, but I wanted to kind of talk about what it's like getting ready for week one of a new format.
I think this is a valuable thing to do because I think a lot of spoiler discussion ends up being not very productive. So people don't use the sort of discussion time they have very well. People spend a lot of time arguing about whether or not a card is good, or whether or not like this deck will be good. When you could just make the deck. You can just play it. You can just jam it and see if it's good.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good place to start. I do definitely want to go through... Basically, I want to think about today, during spoiler season, the reason we're spending so much time on this stuff is to think about the new format. And I want to talk today about approaching limited in a new format, as well as approaching constructed, which is basically just standard. Like, you don't too often get a major shakeup for something like Modern or Legacy.
The only times those have happened were, like, the printing of Oath of the Gatewatch, or maybe even this set release will be similar. Something like Assassin's Trophy will have eternal implications. But it won't be like a huge shakeup. It won't be like a week 1 format. It will still be, a week 573 format that those formats are. But, things will have changed a bit. Mainly it's like bannings that result in those sorts of things. So like Legacy recently, I think, was a relatively week 1 format. The closest Legacy we'll ever get after the banning of Deathrite Shaman and Gataxian Probe. Because that was a huge shake-up. Like, that changed the entire landscape of what was possible with the Legacy deck.
Same with Modern as well for a little bit. It didn't have such massive format implications, but when Jace and Bloodbound Elf were unbanned, everyone was like, whoa!
Yeah, I mean, those definitely changed, again, what's possible to do with your Modern deck. And gave you like powerful options in existing archetypes, but also maybe supported some new ones, and they allowed for a lot more experimentation. Again, they're not quite the same as a week 1 standard format, but that's the closest I think you'll get in something like Modern or Legacy, is after a major unbanning or banning.
Yeah.
Standard, and one of the reasons why I really like Standard, from a deck building and format in general perspective, gets to have way bigger shakeups.
Yeah.
Like Standard, by the end of this month, it'll be like they banned almost all of the good cards. While unbanning an enormous number of new cards that we've never played with before.
Yeah, so I guess if you think of rotation as a BNR announcement, they unban 360 cards or whatever it is that people have never seen before.
Yeah, it's like 200 or something.
And they ban like 1,000.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. That being said, before we jump into talking about week 1 formats, there are a couple spoilers we probably should talk about. You already brought up one, Assassin's Trophy.
Yeah, this card's pretty good.
Yeah? What do you think about it?
I think it will be overrated in Standard, but will still be good there. I don't think that you want to cast this on turn 2 in Standard very often, because I think that ramping your opponent puts you quite far behind.
For sure.
Like, if you're on the draw, and your opponent plays a 2-drop, and you're like, cool, trophy it, and they're like, alright, play a 4-drop, and you're like, oh, I'm so behind.
For those of you listening who don't keep up that much with the spoilers or didn't see Channel Fireball's spoiling of this card. Assassin's Trophy is a 2-mana instant that costs a black and a green mana. And it says, destroy target permanent and opponent controls. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle their library. So it's kind of like a mixture between Abrupt Decay and Path to Exile, but it can hit lands. Well, it can hit anything.
Yeah. It destroys anything, so it can hit Planeswalkers, which is a pretty big deal.
It can hit lands.
Yeah, which is a relatively big deal.
Yeah, and I think that's so important for, like, older formats like Legacy. Like, I actually think this will see some play in Legacy.
I think this is going to be a Legacy staple.
Yeah.
Like, I think the further back in... So, like I said, I think people will overrate it at first in Standard, because I think that this cannot be your only cheap removal.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it is, how are you killing Llanowar Elves?
Yeah.
Like, if your opponent plays a turn 2 Steel Leaf Champion, you probably want to kill it with this, but would you rather not just be casting a cast down?
Mm-hmm.
Like, early in the game, this thing's value is relatively lower. So you want to be, like, caring about killing stuff like Teferi, or Search for Azcanta, or weird permanent types that are always hard to answer. Generally, Planeswalkers, sometimes stuff like artifacts and enchantments.
Yeah.
And the fact that it can also kill creatures is very good, but I think that as a cheap creature removal spell, this is not as good as some other options. Obviously, the flexibility is the power, but you do pay for that with some sort of downside in Standard. In the further back in format you go, the better this is.
I do want to be a little bit careful about that. I know I wasn't playing around when Path to Exile came out, but there are a lot of stories of people who just completely slept on that card and were basically like, wow, like, this card is pretty butts. Giving your opponent a land is just, like, too much of an advantage. And likewise, it saw a bunch of play in Standard. Obviously, it's moved to Modern. And so part of me feels like, yeah, I hear totally what you're saying. Like, this isn't what you want to do to a Llanowar Elves. Totally get it. But I think this card's just good.
I definitely agree that it's good, but I think people will overrate it. I don't think there will be that many decks where it is correct to play 4 of this card in Standard. Mm-hmm. Is my current take. I do think it's powerful, and I do think the flexibility it offers you is, like, a very powerful thing to have access to. But I think that the fact that you do need to also be playing another cheap piece of creature removal, unless you are very aggressive, or, more likely, you are, like, a hardcore control deck whose plan was to flood out your opponent anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that like, people can tend to dismiss that downside. I also think people slightly, like, they overhype how good Path to Exile was in Standard. That card wasn't that good in Standard. It was okay, but it wasn't, like, the best piece of creature removal ever printed.
For sure.
I mean, even if you look at it in Modern, like, giving your opponent a land is a big downside there too.
Yep.
And the decks that play Path to Exile often have trouble against, like, Llanowar Elves decks.
Or I know my favorite, if my mana dork is going to eat a removal spell when I'm playing Storm, it feels so good when it's Path to Exile. Yeah. And you're like, great.
Exactly.
Untap gifts.
The card has real downsides, but the card is also exceptionally efficient at what it's doing. And it's definitely not something to, like, not keep an eye on. I just think that I would seriously examine why I'm playing 4 of it ahead of other removal options. If my decks, I don't think you start with, like, 4 as a default. Mm-hmm. I think that if you want to, like, do that, you should examine what your deck's game plan is and how you're mitigating the downside of giving your opponent a lot of lands.
Yeah, for sure. I can understand.
In Legacy, this card's just insane. It's a sinkhole against Delver.
Yeah.
It gives bug decks the ability to kill Jace the Mind Sculptor and Gurmag Angler, 2, like, big blind spots that they just couldn't deal with before.
Mm-hmm.
And it also gives stuff like Green-Black Depths, like a more mid-rangey good removal spell that can kill, like, Wasteland and stuff to clear the way for them to actually play their Dark Depths.
For sure.
Like, this card is insane in Legacy, in my opinion.
I think it's really good in Modern too.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I see some people being like, "Oh, Jund and Junk are back."
Jund is just not that good in Modern. Modern has just had a paradigm shift since Jund was good.
Yeah, exactly, and that's how I feel too. And I'm kind of like, guys, this card's good, but it's not going to suddenly bring this stuff back to life.
Yeah.
Like, these decks have other systemic issues. I think it's a plus. Like, if the format does get a little bit slower, like, heck yeah, you definitely are back in the game with a little bit of power.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But in general, like...
This doesn't really solve the fact that Jund is still, like, not very good against humans.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, like, if you're not very good against the premier small creature deck, why are you playing Jund?
Mm-hmm. Totally agree.
And, like, you still obviously have a Dr. Tron. This does help. Don't get me wrong. Like, sometimes you'll blow up their Urza's Tower after playing a Tarmogoyf on turn 2, and you will kill them. But I think people will overrate how good this will be against Tron, because that deck is just a pile of search effects and big nonsense. Like, if you kill their Tron land, like, one Ghost Quarter is not enough to stop Tron without a fairly hefty clock.
Yep, that is completely true, and I think you see that time and again. That, heck, even sometimes, like... So Ghost Quarter isn't the best because sometimes they'll just draw a bunch of lambs and kill you, and they don't need to assemble Tron. And again, like you said, you have to have it backed up with a clock. Right. So, moving on
from Assassin's Trophy, which everyone else has talked about at length, and I do still think is an exceptionally strong Magic the Gathering card.
There's a couple other cool spoilers that I would like to talk about, but we're going to save them probably for next episode. When we have the full spoiler. And maybe we'll use them in a couple of examples today, thinking about Standard to come.
A lot of the most exciting cards in the spoiler, in my opinion, are kind of incomplete. Yeah. A lot of them are green-black cards, and we haven't seen any enablers for them. They're all like green-black cards that say, gets really good if you have a big graveyard, but we have no cards in the set so far that give us a way to have a really big graveyard. So I'm kind of just waiting for them to spoil like Grizzly Salvage or something like that lets me actually play these cards.
That'd be sick.
Because if it's just Stitcher's Supplier, I'm not very excited.
Yeah, for sure. I understand that. I don't know. I'm excited about some of the Selesnya and Boros cards, but that shouldn't come as a surprise to literally anyone.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk week 1. So I thought it was really important to think about week 1 in terms of prepping for it, for limited and constructed, because ultimately I think fundamentally they're very similar processes, but they manifest in a bit of different ways, basically. The major one, obviously, is just the nature of the format. Constructed, you're bringing your own deck, so you need to think about deck construction a bit more and to scrutinize your card pool a bit more.
You have a greater variety of options available to you and a bit more freedom in how you build your deck.
Exactly.
So does everybody else. So the standard to which decks are held to is much higher.
Exactly. So let's start with Limited. I think Limited is generally a bit more straightforward. There's plenty of resources to read on this.
I think Limited is also generally one that is neglected slightly, especially by medium-level players.
Mm-hmm.
Because often it requires quite a lot of investment to actually become good at.
Yeah.
And I mean, the main thing is like it's really hard to... There's no shortcut to it. Constructed, you can sometimes just like... Other people can build the best deck. You can be like, oh, this deck is very good. I will get a lot of reps with it, and then I will kill people with this deck.
Yeah,
Limited, you can't really, like... you can't even just, like, read someone's pick order and be like, cool, I'll follow this.
Yeah.
Because it just doesn't... Limited, there are no shortcuts, basically.
Yes, and likewise, because the power level is so much lower in Limited, typically, especially when we're talking about standard sets, basically you need to rest much more on, like, your fundamental knowledge of how Magic works, in terms of performance, in terms of getting results you want. You need to think much more about, like, am I the beatdown? Am I the control? You got to think about...
Do I need to use, like, lineup theory here, such that, like, last game I saw this big bomb, and this is the only card in my deck that answers it, so I need to hold on to it? Or do I need to be like, no, I'm just going to tempo him, my plan is he's not going to draw that?
Or alternatively, it's about making good trades and being like, okay, we're both going to trade resources, but I'm going to come up slightly on top, and that means by the end of all the time when we've been trading all this stuff, I've been sitting on this great card that is going to win me the game. Now, I don't want to go too much into gameplay fundamentals. I mostly want to go through preparation and how you can think about preparing for this new format. So, the first thing first, and this is by far, I think, really the most valuable and part of this process of looking at spoilers, is basically doing your homework and basically trying to think about the theories and the development of the set. I don't mean like, why do they make this mechanic? What's the flavor? I mean more fundamental stuff like, how big are the creatures?
Yeah. So, like, Khans of Tarkir recently came back on Modo, and people were talking about the big things that mattered in that format from a creature sizing perspective, and they were like, so all of your 3-drops need to line up well against a 2/2, because everyone has morphs, so everyone has 3-mana 2/2s in their deck. Mm-hmm. And your big creatures need to line up well against a 5 toughness blocker, because there are a lot of 5 toughness blockers in the set, and if you don't line up against them well, then your deck is just going to stall out against these like control decks that have a bunch of X5s.
Yeah.
So, removal that could kill 5 toughness things was like premium. Things that traded up, or things that traded well with like a 2/2 for 3 were pretty good. Mm-hmm. And like 3/2s for 3, for example, were very bad, because it was like, oh, this is just going to trade with a morph.
Yeah.
Like, this doesn't do anything.
You can see this stuff play out when you look through the codes, look through the commons. Oftentimes, this is the stuff people are not talking about during spoiler season. Yeah. Because this is stuff that's designed specifically for limited. It's typically not stuff that's exciting. But if you want to get an edge, scrutinize these details. They're going to matter a ton.
Yeah.
The other thing to think about that is way more common, and you'll hear people rant and rave about, is what is the removal in the set, specifically at common or uncommon?
Yeah.
And what type of creatures does it deal with? So, like, thinking about Dominaria, had a bunch of really good removal at common, I felt like. You had things like Shivan Fire, you had Vicious Offering, all this kind of stuff. Whereas some other formats, the removal's just like butts. Core 19 was kind of like that.
Yeah, I mean, Khans of Tarkir, the removal was quite poor, because that set was meant to be about creature combat.
Exactly.
So they wanted to make it so that your way of beating creatures was other creatures.
Likewise, though, that tells you what to incentivize. Like, beginning of the format, something like Strangling Spores, in Core 19, it's like, okay, cool, like, I'll pick that up, that's great, it's common removal, it's, whatever, it's gonna kill a 3 toughness thing, it's instant. Yeah. And then as the format went on, it's kind of like, actually, this is just kind of meh. Like, this eventually gets outclassed. 4 mana is a bit expensive for this effect.
Yeah.
And you learn that just from the context of what creatures are cutting about. And
yeah, so that's the important point of, like, how important is it to be 4 toughness in this set, for example? Like, if this is the reason you look at the common removal. It's like, oh, well, all the common removal, only one piece of it, like, kills a 4 toughness creature, let's say. Okay, well, being 4 toughness sounds really good now.
Yeah.
And, like, most of the creatures in the set cap out that there are, like, 4 mana or less, cap out at 3 toughness. There aren't a lot of cap out at 3 power. There's not a lot of 4 power creatures. So, hey, being 4 toughness sounds amazing now.
I mean, this is one of the things I loved. It sounds so silly, and it's kind of become a joke on the team, was that I was so hyped about Wall of Mist for Core 19. Obviously, it's 2 mana, 1 colorless, 1 blue, 0/5 defender. That's it. It's most of the time, this is a trash card, and I'm never gonna look for it beyond like pretty much pick like 10 plus. Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be in the dregs and the packs. But the more I played the set, and we're gonna get into that a little bit more in a second, is basically an 0/5 blocks like almost every single green creature up to 5-drops. Like, the only common that swings through it is Colossal Dreadmaw.
Yeah.
So I was like, actually, if you just draft a couple flyers, you can lock down the ground with a 2-drop?
Yeah.
That's nuts. Obviously, it's not incredible good. It's like a solid, like, 2. You know what I mean? But the thing is, like, it's something that's a really good tool that you can pick up. And if you, like, have, the insight, or you've done your homework, you can see, like, actually this lines up pretty reasonably against enough things where I will bring this in, or sometimes I will main deck it, and it's actually a lot more acceptable than
doing your homework is what allows you to make these connections, and is what differentiates the, like, reasonable limited players who are following a pick order from the great limited players who have an understanding of the format. Because just following a pick order means you would never pick up Wall of Mist and you'd probably never side it in. But if you have an understanding of the format, you would recognize, like, oh, actually my deck might be weak to the things Wall of Mist is good against. So I'll pick up this Wall of Mist and that will shore up my deck's weakness. And like you say, like, it's just like, oh, I have an understanding of the format. I recognize that an 0/5 Wall is not generally a good card, but in this specific context, it has a lot more viability.
Yeah.
So I will start picking it slightly higher. Maybe not too high. Like, you generally aren't... These sorts of intuitions and these sorts of things that you figure out generally aren't things that make it like, I should not draft this Demon Lord Belzenlock. I should draft this 0/5 Wall. They're things that are like, it's pick 8. I think I should value this.
Yes.
Like, people often like to focus on pack 1, pick 1 for limited, but you have 44 picks after that that are just as important, if not more important in several cases. And they're often more complicated. I think pack 1, pick 1 is often the easiest pick.
Yep.
Because
I would say the first 3 picks tend to be the most difficult ones. Or, sorry, the easiest ones. And then after that... it gets way more gray, and you have to make more difficult decisions, and you have to say, like, oh, do I want this Snapping Drake, or do I want this Strangling Spores? This is my second color. I was in red before. Or do I pick, like, a red common that I think is slightly less good than these two?
But doesn't commit me to a second color at all, so I will almost always play it.
Exactly.
Yeah, like, the middle of the pack, I think, is much harder to differentiate the medium power level cards from each other, whereas the first few picks are always just like, this is the best card in the pack. Sometimes you're choosing between two like high power cards, but the thing is that when you're wrong about that, you're not generally like as punished.
Yes.
Like when you're wrong about like, oh, do I pick this premium removal spell or this really good creature? Maybe you pick the wrong one, but at the end of the day, how much worse is your deck? Whereas, do I pick this, like, reasonable removal spell or this reasonable creature? And, like, any individual pick probably won't make a huge difference, but you will make that pick, the reasonable removal spell or reasonable creature, or this, like, this curve topper creature or this, like, curve filler creature, both of which seem about fine. You'll make that pick 40 times. And making sure that pick is correct is why you do your homework and why you establish an understanding of what the power and toughness numbers are in the format, what the good removal is in the format, how everything lines up against everything else. Because that tells you, like, actually, I don't really want this Strangling Spores. Or, yes, I'm playing red-green, but I don't think that I want to like, play this sort of red-green deck. Like, I'm playing red-green, but I don't want Goblin Instigator. Because that's not what the red-green decks are about.
Yes.
I'm playing blue-white, but I don't want this, like, cool white card because it just doesn't contribute to the game plan that this blue-white deck is going to have.
Absolutely. And that's where you get into discussing the archetypes. This is also part of this process of taking a bit... So you want to look at the individual cards, see how they match up, where their power and toughness are, but you want to look at the bigger context of, like, what are the archetypes? What are their game plans? How do they fit together? We also ran into this with... Core 19, where we saw, like, Departed Deckhand.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty aggressive blue creature. It's a 2-drop, 2/2, basically unblockable. But over time, at first we were like, this is awesome, we should pick this really highly. And as we kind of discovered more and kind of looked at the shape of the format, what the rest of the blue cards did, we were like, actually, it's so hard to get an aggressive blue deck. It's really, really tough. Sometimes it can happen, but overall, like... A lot of the cards that are good in this deck are just good in all the other decks. So it's going to be tough to, like, make it work, whereas making a slower blue deck is easier.
Yeah, that reminds me of, like, Kaladesh, where I think that you really liked Windrake.
Yeah.
And then eventually we were like, no, but Holt, none of the blue decks are Windrake decks.
Yeah.
Like, none of them want a 2/2 flyer for 3 because none of them are aggressive enough. They're all, like, Consulate Skygate decks that want to, like... slow everything down and do some artifact synergy stuff and like win eventually with a Gearseeker Serpent. So chip damage is less valuable to them and like cheap flyers are just not how they want to spend their mana early. But then like Ghirapur Osprey or whatever, which is basically White Windrake, got printed in the next set, and that card was great.
Yep.
Because all the white decks were aggressive, and they all wanted a cheap flyer.
Yeah. So, I think we're already starting to see some of the kind of points and figures, some of the things you can think of as hints for Guilds of Ravnica. One of the cards that sticks out the most to me is like Artful Takedown, which is it's a common. It's 4 mana, blue black, and 2 colorless. Instant that says choose one or both. One is tap target creature, and the other mode is target creature gets -2, -4 until end of turn. So I think that's like a big kind of sign that like, okay, for 4 mana at common, 4 toughness, that's got to be like something you need to look out for. I look at this, and to be honest, maybe this is me thinking a bit cynically, I go, oh, there might be a lot of 5 toughness things in this format. 5 toughness might be the point at which something is like adequately big and hard to kill. Whereas things with 4 toughness, it might be a bit easier to shoot them down with commons, if that makes sense. I believe there is another one as well. Is it Hypothesizzle? I think it is.
Yeah, Hypothesizzle, which is 3 blue-red, so 5 mana, draw instant, draw 2 cards, then you may discard a non-land card. If you do, deal 4 damage to target creature.
So again, this is 4 damage removal at common. So, I see
I'm
signals...
sure it was common. I need to double check that, but I think it might have been.
It is.
Okay.
So stuff like that can like guide you a bit, and those are like clear numbers to be on the lookout for, is like looking what's at common and see what it removes. But overall, you'll have to take a look at the whole set when it comes out, and we'll probably be doing that same
It's really hard to get this exact view right now, because we're mostly seeing rares, and the commons we are seeing are gold commons.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hard to really know, because yes, the 2 cards we just described are both like 4 damage kill spells. But like, that will in some way put you ahead if you get to kill a 4 toughness creature with them.
Yeah.
One of them will have drawn a card, one of them will have let you tap a creature, but, like, both of them give you an additional bonus. But like, what does the, like, mono-red... Is there a mono-red common removal spell?
Mm-hmm.
Because you'll see that way more than you will either Hypothesizzle or Artful Takedown.
For sure.
Gold sets in general are a bit harder to get these sorts of reads on at first, because they're full of gold cards, which are very powerful, but show up in less decks by virtue of needing to specifically be those 2 colours.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there'll be maybe 3 red drafters at any given table, so you need to be thinking about, like, oh, Lightning Strike's in this set, but actually that's an uncommon, and the common removal is Electrify, so 4 toughness is, like, what red decks can kill pretty easily. But, like, at any given table there'll be 1 Izzet drafter, and maybe, like, a 3-color drafter. Mm-hmm. And you're just not going to see that many Hypothesizzles in a given draft.
Yeah. Obviously, some of that depends on things like fixing as well. I don't think we should delve too much into that. But the next thing that's really important is what you do with all that research, like all that homework you've done, all those observations. And the first thing is discuss it. You know what I mean? Like, exactly what we're doing right now, in a way, is coming together with players that are on a similar level to you, or people you think are better than you, whatever, but just like mold this stuff over, get their opinions, talk to them, see where they think these things line, and try to look at the cards, see the points they're making, etc., and basically discuss it, map out this stuff together, and try and like synthesize that into some kind of summary, at least at first glance. Now, the thing is, discussion's really good for like theory crafting or looking in the right direction, but it's more like analysis. And the process of like getting into a format and figuring it out means that you're going to go through this process of like collecting data and then analyzing it, and then collecting data and analyzing it over again. So when you discuss stuff, you're kind of like synthesizing, you're analyzing that data, but your actual data collection, sometimes it's stuff like looking at the spoilers, but a lot of times it's playtesting. And especially, this goes for all Magic, when it comes to playtesting, there really is no substitute. You're going to learn your formats so much better especially limited, if you just get on Magic Online fire drafts as soon as they come out in pre-release, try sealed pools, do all this kind of stuff, and actually play them. This is something that took me a while to figure out, as I used to, years ago when I wanted to practice limited, be like, okay, I'm going to generate a sealed deck, and then I'm going to try and make the best one I can, and blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't actually tell you how the format plays out. So for a lot of players, I think they're like, oh, I want to go through the exercise of deck creation, but they don't actually get insight into the format when they do that. You got to play your matches. You got to get into it.
Yeah, limited really, like we've said, there is just no substitute for just like going on Modo and jamming several leagues of drafting. Mm-hmm. Because that is the way that you figure out, like, the thing about limited that a lot of people don't really pay enough attention to is that there is actually a metagame for limited that, like, is harder to see, but does exist. Take, like, Amonkhet as an example.
Oh, are we going to talk about Slitherblades?
Not totally. Although that is an important... That was like a fringe archetype, right? Where, like, some dudes at the Pro Tour did really well by just drafting every Slitherblade they could and every, like, cartouche they could and just killing people.
Yeah, I think it was Andrea Mengucci.
And Calcano. The MTG Mint card team.
Exactly.
They did really well with that strategy. That was, like, a weird, like, once-off strategy, I think.
Yeah, but...
Because once that deck comes out into the public eye, the reason why you could make that deck stops existing.
Exactly. But that does kind of come to your point of metagaming, where it's like, in Limited, there's going to be strategies that are more popular. People are going to rate certain cards more highly, certain interactions more highly. And likewise, that means the patterns of play are going to come out. People are going to make the same types of decks. Yeah. So that also gives you a chance to think about, is there something you can do to abuse that metagame? That's what Andrea Mengucci and Calcano did. Was they said, no one is drafting these Slitherblades. Actually, they're 1/1 unblockables.
1/2 unblockables.
Ooh, 1/2 unblockables. Is there any way we can just boggle people?
Yeah. So they took there were two, like, immediately obvious ways of abusing a metagame in Limited, in my opinion. One of them is that approach where you're like, this card is bad on its face. However, if I get enough of them, and like a critical mass of this sort of effect, I can build a very specific deck that is very good. Mm-hmm. And that abuses, like, the way that people want to play this format. The other way is something that I think is slightly more important fundamentally to understand, which is, so if you went into Amonkhet, into a draft late in the format, and you hadn't played that much of it, someone would have said to you, red-white aggro is really good. Mm-hmm. Right? In Constructed, your initial assumption might be, I should just play red-white aggro. Like, in Constructed right now, like, a lot of people's default assumption is just, I'm just going to play red-black Chain Whirler. Yeah. And that's fine in Constructed because there is an effectively infinite amount of Chain Whirlers that people can play. Yep. And boy, do they play them. In Limited, this isn't the case. Like, if 4 people sit down at that draft pod saying, I'm just going to play red-white aggro, because that's just the best deck. Suddenly
no one is playing a good red-white aggro deck.
Yeah, you have 4 people playing a bad version of red-white aggro, and then maybe there's someone else at that table who went, no one's picking these blue cards. And yeah, maybe blue wasn't as good that set, but because nobody is fighting you for the blue cards, you make a really sick blue-green ramp deck and you kill everybody else. Mm-hmm. This is not me advocating for playing underpowered decks in Limited necessarily, but it's me trying to say that, like, you need to understand what everyone else around you at the table is going to be trying to do.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also just, like, your standard rules for preparing for an event, which is, read the articles, check out what people are saying. A lot of people will see what pro players are saying, and they go, when they read an article on Channel Fireball or SCG or whatever, and someone says, this is the best deck in this Limited format, people are going to try and force that deck. And a lot of pro players actually are on that strategy as well, where they're like, I think it's just better EV. I don't think I'm that good as a drafter. Yeah. So I'm going to pick a strategy that typically has a high chance of success rather than drafting the hard way, a la Ben Stark.
Yeah, I remember Ben Stark had his article, which is still worth reading as a Limited article. It's still excellent. Drafting the hard way, where he talks about drafting the easy way, where, Lyra, I'll be white this draft. Mm-hmm. I got a Bells Unlock in Pack 2. I'll be white-black this draft. Yeah. And then not moving. That's drafting the easy way. It works out sometimes, and it doesn't others, and you have very little control over whether it does. Mm-hmm. Drafting the hard way is reading signals and figuring out what everyone else around you at the table is doing and putting yourself into the open archetypes that are going to produce a functional deck 80% of the time.
Yeah.
And then Joel Larson wrote a follow-up article years later called Drafting the Medium Way, which is where he goes, yeah, I don't just stick with my first pick, but I go into each set with 3 decks that I think are the best decks, and I just try and find whichever one of those decks is open, and then I just draft that one.
And that's definitely drafting the easy way.
No, I don't think that's necessarily true. Drafting the easy way specifically is not actually paying any attention to the metagame.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's it's just taking your powerful first pick.
Yeah, for sure.
And just
hoping
not moving.
Hoping it's open, yeah. I will say that when you're starting in a new format, to kind of reel it in a little bit, because I feel like we're getting into just kind of wider draft theory in general.
Yeah, that's true.
Don't try to out-meta too hard in the first week. Just look for the stuff that's strong. And actually, this leads us nicely into week 1 of Constructed.
Yeah.
So for Limited, you can kind of look at the set, the card pool's smaller, and you can kind of get a more complete idea. It'll take a little bit more legwork, but you can kind of know, these are the cards that will be played. Constructed is not necessarily the same, because everything is so context dependent. Decks can obviously very much abuse certain strategies, build around certain strategies, and make that a much more apparent thing. So thinking about Constructed, I like to kind of think about what types of decks typically exist in Standard. And this goes for pretty much every metagame I've played in the last 4 or 5 years of playing Magic. There's typically extremely linear decks.
Yes.
But they just have a game plan and they want to do it and it's powerful.
These are commonly aggressive decks a la Sly, or more recently stuff like the Lana Royale Steel Leaf Champion decks. Mm-hmm. Most of the Chain Whirler decks we've seen are close to this, although Chain Whirler decks have moved up and down the linearity scale quite a bit. But the traditional mono red ones are fairly linear. They just want to do their thing and that thing will kill you. Seal of Champion decks. I would also classify the Mono Blue Storm decks this way, although those are very different in terms of how they end up playing out. They are quite linear in they're I'm just going to do my thing, and my thing is very powerful, and you will die after I do it.
Mm-hmm. The other end of that spectrum to me, so this is kind of beyond just the aggro mid-range control spectrum. This is kind of a different thing. But it does have some correlations.
Yeah.
The other side of that spectrum is reactive decks that are basically built to have the best answers for what's good.
Yes. So you see, obviously, blue-white control, Esper control, blue-black control are the things that immediately jump to mind. But some of your mid-range decks fall into this depending on how they're positioned. Mm-hmm. For example, like I say, the Chain Whirler decks moved up and down this. The Chain Whirler decks that were playing Bomat Courier and Chandra and playing as little black as possible and just trying to license integration people out that showed up a lot early. Those decks are pretty linear, right?
Yeah.
But then the versions that were splashing for Vraska's Contempt and playing a lot more reactive cards and generally trying to be the bigger mid-range, those are getting into much more reactive territory. Mm-hmm. They're still relatively linear, but they have a lot more cards that are good because of what their opponent is playing, rather than just good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and pretty much any deck that plays Settle the Wreckage is going to be pretty reactive.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the main thing to kind of realize about this is that the power of these decks are derived from context, rather than just these cards being bonkers on their own necessarily. Yeah. A lot of them are still going to be powerful effects, but in general, they're going to be tuned well to react to certain threat bases that are prevalent in the meta. And then you kind of have this gray space in between. By the way, I don't think decks are just either linear or reactive or synergistic. I think they can be a mixture there within. But you kind of have this place in the middle that I consider synergistic decks, which basically, the cards that are in it by themselves are not that powerful, but all the construction part of it comes together to make a deck that's a lot greater than the sum of its parts, as it were.
I would say that synergistic is a different axis.
For sure.
That decks move on. Some decks are much higher synergy and some decks are lower synergy. Synergy and the difference between synergy and combo is something that gets slightly hotly debated. Probably more than it needs to be. People are very people care a lot about categorizing decks, where the most important thing actually is just understanding this deck's play patterns.
Yeah.
Not putting a name to them necessarily.
For sure.
But yeah, I would say that synergy is like a slightly different axis, and high synergy decks tend to be linear, but are not always.
Yeah.
A high synergy deck might be something like Legacy Storm, like which all those cards work very well together, or Modern Affinity.
Yeah.
Those cards are all built and work very well together, where Arcbound Ravager is not necessarily an exciting card on its own, and, for example, Ornithopter is actually a better example there of a card that is not an exciting card on its own, but works very well with all of the things that are going on around it.
Yes.
Dark Ritual is probably an exciting card, but Lion's Eye Diamond and Infernal Tutor, on their own, aren't that exciting as cards.
You need something to enable these cards and to be able to take full advantage of their power. And I think when I go into week 1 of a format, I kind of think about it a little bit like minimal acceptable product.
Yeah.
So for people who are not familiar, oftentimes when someone comes up with like an invention or a new product they want to sell, they'll basically come out and they'll say, this is the big idea, and this is what I want. This is going to be it ideally. However, by the time I have finished with all my funds and all my time I need to complete this product, once all that stuff's out, I will put it to market so long as it has these qualities. So they'll be below the standard that is ideal, but they'll be, enough where they think the product is good enough to sell. And so my kind of minimum acceptable selling product is like, just find the deck with the most powerful stuff in the format. Like, identify the power cards. Identify the cards that are good on rate. Identify the things where it's just like, okay, this is an inherent 2-for-1. This is a big creature. Like, it's hard to answer. And basically put them together and try to see how they fit. And make something with a reasonable curve, relatively speaking, and go, okay, let's try this.
Yeah. So, in this specific example of the week 1 format that we're approaching, this is going to be one of the biggest shakeups that Standard sees. As we talked about it way earlier in this episode, Standard sees much bigger shakeups than any other format, and a huge amount of the very strong linear strategies are leaving. Hazaret is not going to be there anymore, and neither is Bomat Courier. And those are some of the strongest linear things to possibly be doing in this Standard right now. So, now we're left with, like, the most obvious week 1 deck will be the strongest surviving linear thing that you can do.
Yeah. I would presume if I had to venture a guess, it would be some kind of red deck.
See, I would actually guess it would be a green deck.
Okay.
Because I believe that the most powerful 1-drop that remains in Standard is Llanowar.
For sure.
And the most powerful thing to pair Llanowar with immediately is Steelleaf Champion.
But goblins, man. All them goblins.
I do think that there is a possibility of a very strong red deck, although I actually don't think it would be goblins in week 1. I think it will probably be Flame of Keld.
Yeah, for sure.
Because
that's already established.
A reasonable amount of Flame of Keld actually doesn't leave.
Yep.
Like, Hazaret leaves and some other stuff, but a lot of the burn, which is what the deck is really built around, Chain Whirler, several of the 1-drops, like, the deck wasn't even into, like, that many of the 2-drops that the other mono red decks played anyway. Like, I think that deck sticks around a bit more than people think it will.
Anyways, go on.
But so, like, in my opinion, like, early on in this format, you're probably looking at a lot of people playing Llanowar Steelleaf Champion decks, because the mana's just as good as it was before to be able to splash, like, these black cards. It's a fairly developed concept, and we've already iterated on it several times, so we know what you want in this deck and what you don't. It loses some cards, but not many, and a lot of them have fairly easy replacements.
Yeah. So it's a pretty... Being able to kind of take that old deck, as you put it, it's already been developed. It's been fine-tuned to a certain extent. You're not going to have a perfectly tuned deck for week 1. The point is to just be like, can I use all these powerful synergies?
Yeah.
Or just all these powerful cards.
Yeah. If the most aggressive thing you can be doing that kills people the fastest is making a 5/4 on turn 2, just make a 5/4 on turn 2.
Exactly.
This is like... My concept of week 1 generally is that you should probably be playing the most powerful linear deck, because generally I think people assume that other people will have come to their conclusions more than that actually happens. And in week 1 this is especially true, because, so let's say you've done your research, you've done your testing, you guys are pretty sure that there's like a Boros Tokens deck a mono red aggro deck, and a mono green aggro deck that are all going to be great in week 1. And you think those are all going to be like the expected metagame. So you're like, bam, we've got this sick red-white control deck that plays a bunch of sweepers, plays the new sweeper, that's like 3 damage to all creatures, and your creatures gain lifelink.
Yep.
We're playing like Lyra as our finisher. We get to play like Settle and
Deafening Clarion.
Yeah, we get to play Cleansing Nova. You know, we get to play all these like big sweepers, and we get to play like these big knockout punch like finishers. Not suggesting this deck would necessarily be good, by the way. Just a hypothetical. But like this deck crushes all those aggro decks, right? Because you just like sweeper them, Lyra, kill them.
Yeah,
like that sounds great. Sounds perfect against all these aggro decks. So you sit down for round 1, and your round 1 opponent goes like Overgrown Tomb Lana or Elf. And you're like, oh, excellent. I'm going to kill him. It's going to be great. And then he plays a Gift of Paradise on turn 2, and you're like, oh, what?
This is weird.
I didn't know about this. And then he plays like a Gilded Lotus on turn 3, and you're like, oh no, what's happening? And then he plays an Omniscience on turn 4, and another Gift of Paradise.
And you just realize suddenly you're so dead.
Yeah, and then he just kills you. And that deck maybe isn't very good. It probably can't beat a Steel Leaf Champion on turn 2.
No.
But it can beat you, Mr. Sweepers, who didn't really come prepared for any nonsense. And then round 2 you face like Grixis Midrange, which is kind of untuned and has a bunch of stuff going on, but your deck isn't really set up to answer endless 2-for-1s, and that's just all he does.
Deafening Clarion does not kill Nicol Bolas.
Yeah, he just like plays a Nicol Bolas and then plays like another big thing, and oh man, he's super greedy and he's splashing green for Vraska, and like, oh, okay, that's stupid, and he's probably going to die to his mana a lot, but he killed you because you're super slow and you give him infinite time. And like, generally, this is not... Obviously, this is incredibly anecdotal and isn't obviously a real example. My point is more that by trying to level the week 1 format, you often put yourself in a situation where the people who have not even come close to level 1 yet, of which there will be many, especially at big tournaments like SCGs, they just get to beat you.
Yeah.
Because their weird nonsense piles that aren't really tuned yet do beat up on people who just give them time.
Now, I think basically the gist of this is like, if you're going to approach the new format and you try to make a deck that is reactive, a level 2 deck, whatever you want to call it, something that's trying to attack a certain strategy, you're taking a shot in the dark. Now, don't get me wrong, there's pros who can do it, who can sit down and they have such a good read on the meta, adequate testing, and really good intuition as well, and they can build a control deck to success in week 1. Spoilers, usually that does not happen by us normie folks, people who are developing competitive, unless in the previous format there was already a good control deck and they went, oh, okay, we'll add a couple new cards.
And that can be true of this format. It's just something to examine, basically. When you're playing a control deck in a dark format, you need to be able to say, or a reactive deck in general, you need to be able to say, like, okay, I'm playing answers that line up universally enough.
Yeah.
You know, my game plan is reasonable enough against nonsense that, like, I'm not just going to lose to the dude who brought Mirari Conjecture control, or, like, is playing the Antiquities War, but there's no good artifacts. Oh, but I guess his deck is full of bad ones.
Like, I think a good way to think about this is, even if you think about, like, really high power formats, like, imagine for a moment you're playing Legacy and somehow all the knowledge of Legacy decks has been wiped off the face of the earth. No one knows what's good. You just get this card pool of like 18,000 cards, whatever. Week 1, I guarantee you there will be a deck like Show and Tell that is going to crush.
Yes.
And I also guarantee you Death in Taxes never wins that tournament.
Yeah.
And this is the exact thing. You go for the power week 1 when things are unclear, where you can just straight up say, you know, I'm going to win. I'm going to do something busted and powerful. As opposed to saying like, oh, I'm going to figure out what things line up, how to best abuse the mana bases in this format. Oh, what can I do to make sure the counter magic isn't very good? You know what I mean? Death and Taxes is one of those decks that specifically knows what it is trying to answer.
Yeah.
It's meta-tuned, and many reactive decks are. Many control decks, even in Standard, are. So not that it can't be done, but be wary.
Yeah.
Have a good think about how you're trying to construct your deck when you don't know when the new format will look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also, generally, it has been the rule that, like, week 1 gets won by an aggro deck. Mm-hmm. This is not always the case. I remember that in, I think, the first tournament of Ixalan Standard, a deck playing 4 Hostage Taker and 4 Blossoming Defense won the tournament. But that deck was also relatively linear. If you look at a card like Blossoming Defense, it's very much just saying, look, I'm just going to do the thing I'm trying to do. And that thing is going to be powerful. Mm-hmm. And that format was less of a dark one. You know, we knew that, like, these energy synergies were good. Because remember, this is before Attune with Ether and Rogue Refiner got banned. Ugh. So, you know, Hostage Taker was kind of slightly hyped, and people, like I think the Jessup brothers built this deck around it where they were like, okay, well, I'm just going to play Hostage Taker, and I'm going to protect it, and then I'm going to untap with a Hostage Taker and cast the card under it, and then that's probably going to win me the game.
Yeah.
And I'm going to play Scarab God, and I'm going to play a couple of other, like, powerful, like, mid-rangey Sultai cards, like Glintstleaf Siphoner. I'm just going to play good on rate cards, and just, like, run my opponent over with my, like, powerful mid-range options. Mm-hmm. So the week 1 deck doesn't have to be, like, super aggressive mono-green, mono-red aggro, but you do generally want to be doing stuff where no matter what your opponent is doing, your cards are just, like, good cards.
Yes, and you are able to execute that plan consistently.
Yeah.
There's a reason why a lot of times it's an aggro deck that wins the beginning. It's because usually they ask the least of their mana base and do the most with the cards that are in it. You know what I mean? You don't have to work hard to say, like, turn 1, I'm going to make a Savannah Land. If you don't have a dedicated strategy or you're not prepared for this, you're probably dead. Because turn 2, I'm going to make a hasty dude, or turn 2, I'm going to make 2 more dudes. Like, you got to be ready for this. I'm going to do my thing. Are you?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the, like, weirder or more reactive or more synergistic decks are just not going to be tuned to be able to do their thing nearly as consistently as the aggro decks are, because the aggro decks are, like, much more straightforward to build. It's much easier to go, like, oh yeah, so I want to be playing the best creatures on rate for each curve slot, and then some way of finishing the game.
That being said, do not let us put you off trying new things. Actually, the next thing I really want to say is, do try new things. Once you figure out what's powerful, first of all, figure out what that deck looks like. Put it all together, make it look good. Get your proxy, get a printer, proxy some cards, you know what I mean, and actually sit down and play with it. And this same goes, usually the place that I go after, like, finding, like, okay, these things look valuable, this looks good, I'm expecting a lot of this, is starting to look more at the weirder, unclear synergy decks that are like, okay, is there anything really powerful I can generate a ton of value off of that's very specific? Does that deck exist? I personally enjoy that hunt, but
I think that hunt is valuable.
Yes.
Any synergy deck is similar to control decks in some ways. Obviously, they don't have to line up their answers in the same way. Control decks, obviously, Seal Away is a great Magic card. But if the best 2-drop in the format is Heart of Kiran,
you're in trouble.
It makes your Seal Away look very foolish. Mm-hmm. Synergy decks don't have that immediate problem. You know, they don't. It's not like, oh, well, my removal spells don't line up. That's not what I'm talking about. When you're building a synergy deck, you do need to know what the proactive decks look like, though, because let's say, you're building Mono Blue Storm, and the best proactive deck in the format makes Steel Leaf Champion on turn 2. Okay, well, my plan to stall the game out is Sigh.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
No, it does not.
They're just going to kill me. And similarly, like, the big green-black 6-drop that got spoiled a little while ago is Oni, that, like, it's a 2/3, it makes a 1/1 for every creature you control that you have in the graveyard, like, that card has real potential to make an enormous board state. Mm-hmm. In, like, the right synergy deck. Like, you're playing 30 creatures and a Stitcher Supplier and, like, a Grizzly Salvage if that card is in this format. You know, that card has, like, real potential as, like, a top-end payoff in some kind of graveyard synergy deck. But if like, 20% of the room is playing Chain Whirler, and the best aggressive thing to be doing is Chain Whirler, why do you want to make a bunch of 1/1s?
Yeah, totally. So you got to make sure that, like, the payoffs for your synergies are good enough. And that's going to take some hunting. That can be really rewarding because sometimes you find something absolutely busto, like Eldrazi Winter happens.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or
Emrakul.
Yeah, Emrakul.
Emrakul was super slept on in spoiler season, and then turns out that mind-slavering your opponent and getting a 13/13 on the cheap is, like, really good, actually.
Spoilers. The thing is, though, a lot of these decks in particular, it's really, really unclear how good they are until you try them. And kind of going back to the discussion versus playtesting, discussion is good analysis, but the thing is, when you're going into an unknown format, play as many games as you can. Get the decks out, jam them together, see how it feels. Because the thing is, oftentimes you can run into these stalemates where you're just like playing what ifs or whatever. Basically, Team Vol, we went through a whole process, especially at the beginning, of just like figuring out how we can discuss things profitably. There was a lot at the beginning of people being like, no, that's trash, as a response to, what about this? Or like, dies to Doomblade.
That kind of thing of like, oh, but it can't beat this card, which isn't a very profitable discussion to have. Partly due to some stuff we talked about, I think in the previous episode, where we talk about how actually, you get burned by the cards that you underrate way more than the ones you overrate.
For sure.
But also because, like, that's not actually discussing how this card plays and the play patterns that it encourages and that it, like, goes into. It is not actually discussing how this card is in a game of Magic. You're just, like, playing, like, a one-upmanship game where you're just, like, naming a card that beats it.
Yeah.
Like, and it just doesn't... It doesn't give the person you're talking to any actionable data to go on.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, like, really help anybody in terms of things. Like, you can say, I think that this 2-drop is not very good because this 1-mana removal is played very heavily. Or, like, I think this 1-mana removal is some of the most powerful in the format, and I think that the play patterns line up where you're going to get tempoed a lot if you play this 2-drop, and then your opponent plays this 1-mana removal. It doesn't mean that 2-drop is necessarily going to be terrible, but it is an important thing to bear in mind.
Yeah, and that's something you can take forward in testing, in your deck construction, all that kind of stuff.
Be like, how often when I play this 2-drop, or this 3-drop, or whatever, do I end up feeling behind because my opponent was able to double spell me next turn alongside a 1-mana removal spell?
Mm-hmm.
Really what you need to be doing with your discussions is couching it in play patterns, and how this card actually plays in a game of Magic. A good example of this to me, of a card that was actually very high quality, is Chandra Torture Defiance.
Yeah.
Where when it got released...
She did not see very much play, did she?
So, she was super hyped. Most hyped card in Kaladesh, I think. For good reason. The card is excellent.
Yeah.
But, when she comes out, Smuggler's Copter also comes out, which kind of makes a lot of Planeswalkers look kind of bad, especially ones who go down to a low loyalty when they come in and do their most impactful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And also, Thraben Inspector is a very highly played card, and that card kind of makes Chandra look kind of bad, because you come down and you Flame Tankavu something, but then their Thraben Inspector kills your Chandra, and you've kind of played 4-mana, deal 4, gain 1 life.
Yeah,
which isn't very good.
Yep. There's also
plus,
Gideon.
Yeah, Gideon exists at the same mana cost, and plays a bit better against most of the, like, Planeswalker removal, because he comes down, he makes a 2-2, or he makes an emblem. More often he makes a 2-2, and your opponent's like, oh, I guess Ruinous Path him, and you're like, cool, I still have a 2-2. Whereas Chandra was much harder to get a full card out of when you played her. Plus, she didn't play that well against Gideon himself. Your opponent plays Gideon and makes a 2-2, and you're like, oh, I can't play this Chandra.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean she wasn't powerful, though. No. Clearly, she's had her time to shine.
Yeah, eventually, people found a deck that she actually played well in, the red-green Marvel deck, and then since then, I don't think she's really dropped out of standard very much. There's just always been a deck that was interested in Chandra. We had these great mono-red decks where having access to her gave you this incredible bridge mid-range plan. And she's since then just been a very powerful card. But early on, it wasn't that she was a bad card. It was that her play patterns didn't line up against what the rest of the format was doing.
And likewise, when you're testing and exploring cards, seeing what they match up against, these are interactions you need to be looking for. Sometimes the cards that look amazing actually don't line up all that well. Sometimes the cards that seem a bit niche, maybe a bit cute, maybe a bit too synergistic, actually end up having really awesome play patterns against a large amount of the meta. The thing is, you're not going to realize it unless you get down in the trenches and you do the work and you find some people to play with, you proxy up the cards, and you do the thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That is really... I think that's the real takeaway from this episode, is just... There is no real substitute for just playing games of Magic. Because that will tell you the most that you can possibly know about how these Magic cards work.
There's things you can look for, but ultimately I think you're right, it's fun having discussions. You can provoke thoughts. You can inspire people and get creative that way.
It's also much less investment.
Yeah, much less time intensive. That's the thing, is a lot of this stuff you're kind of balancing with the reality of we only have so much time to test decks. Getting ready for week 1. Between the full spoilers and between like your first big event, could be like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's not very much time to test decks. So the thing is, basically what we're trying to offer is like things to look out for and to be aware of.
Yeah, ways to make the most out of your time.
Exactly.
And ways to not have really unproductive conversations or even just unproductive playtesting sessions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and really like learning how to identify when something is bad because the card is bad, or when something is bad because the play patterns don't line up.
Mm-hmm.
And figuring that sort of stuff out can be important. And just like trying as much stuff as you possibly can.
Yep.
I think that's all we're going to talk about today. If you enjoyed listening to us talk, you can find more of us, or more of people talking, this time in written form, on murphysvault.com, where we have access to some articles, as well as single store and event tickets and stuff like that, if you're ever in the Edinburgh area. We also can be found, us personally, at F_Ironside on Twitter for myself, and
at Cap'n Powerhouse for me. That's CAPNPOWERHAUS.
So you can follow us there for updates on more personal things.
Yeah, hit us up. Tell us what you think.
Yeah, we're always happy to hear what listeners think about what we're doing. Anything that you think we could talk about more, anything you think we could talk about less, anything you think...
I'm sure there's a lot of that.
Holt could do with his face to really like add stuff to the podcast.
Yeah, maybe there's some kind of way I could shave my beard or cut my hair
fun.
that would increase your podcast listening experience.
Okay. Next week, I shave Holt's beard. We've been From the Vault, and you've been fantastic.